Well, when I was reading your dissertation, what I really felt like was in there was this idea of looking and using the banjo as almost this way to explore racism in America, specifically in Appalachia. Is that accurate to what your dissertation was? Did I kind of get it?
I mean, yeah, I think that's a good synopsis of like the thought process and the ways in which the banjo operates as kind of this artifact in American history, where we can trace the origins of the banjo to show us the origins of, in many cases, like we can use the banjo to kind of help us understand these systemic racial structures in the U.S. from their origins all the way to current day, and the way in which the banjo has kind of this parallel trajectory with race and class in the US, as well as within the music industry and race and class in the US. So, as the music industry developed, so did race and class structures, because race and class structures ultimately were at the backbone of the music industry, and the music industry followed what these societal racial structures were doing in the first place. So it's really quite telling, things like minstrelsy, for instance, and the role of enslavement and the role that the banjo played for both liberation and oppression really tells a story of, yes, oppression, yes, racism, yes, violence, but it also tells a story of hope and liberation.
What is it about the banjo that makes it this an artifact that's capable of doing that?
That's a question. That's a great question, and I don't think I can precisely answer that with, in 30 minutes or even an hour. Rihanna Giddens talks about a lot of this in terms of we need to stop thinking of history as like black and white and hit one history as opposed to another one. Uh, you know, Essentially stealing from another, as opposed to thinking of like this constant flowing and evolution of history. And the banjo's really there. It's kind of the backbone of that evolution in lots of ways. And I think going back to the origins of the banjo being from Africa, it's an African instrument brought over on the transatlantic slavery, brought on the ships, aboard the ships, as a way to kind of, as horrible as this sounds, and it is horrible. Transatlantic slavery is just abysmal. It's horrible. It's like one of the worst things that humans have done to one another. But the banjo was brought on board to keep up morale, to keep people alive. And in a way, as horrific as slavery is, the banjo was that mechanism of hope. It was a mechanism of oppression, but it was also a mechanism of hope, a mechanism to release one's sort of struggles, even for a moment, but also as a way to kind of like talk to one another and speak to one another in ways that probably weren't allowed on the ships, or maybe you couldn't communicate with people who you didn't speak the same language of, yet you spoke music, right? You spoke the banjo, and it's those echoes that kind of echo through the history in Appalachia, but also around the country and around the world. The banjo's worldwide. It's Americana is like one of the biggest genres in the world. Country music is one of the biggest genres in the world, and the banjo is right there at the heart. It's that history that's at the heart of all of this, yet it's never spoken about. And I think the original banjo griots, the ones that told these stories early on, the African players, and I think Sinners does a decent job of this as well. The new picture by Ryan Coogler, right? It does a pretty decent job of this. I think it misses some parts, but it's the telling of those stories and kind of the ways in which it links to all of these different eras in time, but also the ways in which it tells a similar story and it kind of connects people together. And I think that's the beauty of the banjo, and kind of what Rihanna Giddens is saying. Everyone is kind of connected through that history because it's American history. African American history is American history, and we're all kind of connected. It's about talking about it. And the banjo gives us that opportunity to talk about it because those echoes are so loud today that, people ignore it, but maybe we shouldn't. That's kind of the point.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the banjo coming to America from Africa. I'm curious, is there a pivotal point in our history where it evolved from being an African instrument to what people may more stereotypically view as like an Appalachian instrument?
Yeah, so this is something I teach in my classes, and this is something I'm very cognizant of, this whitewashing of history, which again, the banjo is so good at kind of linking all of our histories together and telling these stories so clearly, yet no one really listens to it because of that whitewashing of history. So I would say around, the 1800s or so is when the banjo was starting to become more popular with white people. They were starting to hear it more. Before, there's this book, Half Barbaric Twang, where it's talked about as like this kind of rough music that white people don't really quite like, it's the Thomas Jefferson talks about it that way. Others talk about it. There's something interesting about it, compelling about it, but it's not quite like mainstream. People don't really like it, but a lot of people are playing it. A lot of people are still dancing to it, right? And that's also very much linked to hip hop. You think about hip hop when hip hop was first coming around in the mid 70s, and kind of those garages and all around like Brooklyn, and these communities coming together singing their stories. The same thing was said about hip hop, no, that it's this kind of rough, kind of edgy, criminal music, so to speak, right? This criminality almost attached to it, or this otherness attached to it, I think is a better word. But in the 70s and 80s, obviously you have the war on drugs kind of coming in, and that criminality attached to it. But with the banjo, it's kind of this otherness, and yes, in many ways, criminality attached to it as well, particularly with the slave trade. And so I think, yeah, around that time, the 1800s or so, you had more white people starting to kind of like it or talk about it more. And interestingly, I believe in that book they talk about like women picking it up as well, which is fascinating. I don't know as much about that. That wasn't something I really focused on, but that is a fascinating pivot. But around like the 1830s, you have this guy named Thomas Dartmouth Rice, who's considered like the father of minstrelsy, who really kind of took it upon himself to learn the banjo from the griots originally. And he went around and did minstrel shows where he would kind of sing these songs that he learned, but did it more in kind of like a mocking, stereotypical way, kind of denoting true Black culture. Again, I put that in quotation marks, true Black culture. And then really around the turning point was probably like in the 1830s with Thomas Dartmouth Rice, but then comes along Joel Sweeney. And Joel Sweeney from Appomattox, Virginia, is considered like the father of the 5-string banjo, because he put that fifth string on there, right? And then with that fifth string, you could kind of tune it lower to be more compatible with the fiddle. And that's where you get that kind of interaction with the banjo and the fiddle. However, the history is so skewed because there is evidence that Black people were playing the fiddle much, much earlier. And there was this interaction, this fusion. Again, going back to that Rihanna Giddens quote, like there is that fusion that was already occurring where Black people were playing the fiddle in the 1700s as well. They were going to balls, they were playing fiddles, they were playing banjo. And, there's no like actual history there. There's no one documenting it and writing it down, which makes it so difficult to really say for sure. Actually, Black people were playing, right, the fiddle and the banjo well before the minstrels. We can't say that, right? It's just kind of, it was common knowledge that Black people played the banjo, but there was no like written evidence that this was the actual history. And so that makes a lot of this difficult, but you kind of have to piece things together. And so the 1830s, Joel Sweeney, considered the father of the banjo. And around that turn, he kind of started doing the Virginia minstrels, and minstrelsy really started taking full effect, blackface, blacking up, as kind of like this mocking, stereotypical image of the African American as this kind of buffoon, this dim-witted buffoon in a way. It was more like uh, slavery is kind of promoting slavery in a way. Was backing slavery as in the happy-go-lucky slave, as the Black person was actually happy being a slave, and that's what a lot of this minstrel music did. It's not to say the minstrel music was bad; it wasn't. Which is kind of weird to say, but the minstrel music was incredibly popular. The minstrelsy was incredibly popular. It was basically what pop music would be today, is what you would hear with the minstrel songs. Things like Jump Jim Crow, for instance, that's Thomas Dartmouth Rice. But the history of Jump Jim Crow is another one where you have this interpretation of Jump Jim Crow by Thomas Dartmouth Rice, but Jump Jim Crow was written by enslaved peoples as a satire on enslavers and the ways in which they kept pushing the enslaved to go, 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 go. No matter what I do, I have to jump Jim Crow. I got to jump, jump, jump. You got to go faster and faster and faster. And there, it was a satire on like, no matter what I do, I'm always kind of being pushed to the edge and I can't do it anymore. Whereas Thomas Dartmouth Rice took this as like the happy-go-lucky slave narrative, and from there you have minstrelsy kind of taking off, and you have this image of this black, yeah, this dim-witted black buffoon, kind of criminal, kind of slave person that became a stereotypical understanding of black culture in the U.S., and that's really where this took off. And from the 80s onward, minstrelsy kind of ruled the day, and it wasn't just in the South; it was in the North. It went overseas. People really love this idea of traditional Black culture as told by white people in blackface. And blackface didn't go anywhere. I mean, we still have blackface today. People still do it. It's insane. Jimmy Kimmel did it in 2000, I think 2007, right? Did like full blackface with like Carl Malone. So yeah, I mean, that's where the history really took off. That's where that distortion took off, was this whitewashing of the banjo as this white man's instrument, because Joel Sweeney obviously is the one that popularized the 5-string banjo and kind of made it infamous in many ways.
And so did it shift then from more minstrel type performances to other performances, being played in non-minstrel settings?
Yeah, so I mean, minstrel was basically what you would think of as like early string band music. So this is pre music industry. And you would have banjo playing on steamboats, you'd have banjo playing all over, right? There's a good book by Phil Jameson called Hoedowns, Reels, and Frolics. That's a fantastic book that discusses kind of dance, but it also gets into this understanding of early banjo players, early minstrel players. Cecilia Conway as kind of the 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 biggest voice on this, I would say, in terms of like her research on the banjo and her groundbreaking interviews with people like can't think of his name right now. It'll come to me. There's so many names that float around, but she did a lot of interviews with North Carolina Piedmont banjo players, black banjo players that you wouldn't think of. But all these people were playing the banjo, but no one really cared about it, despite these people being like the predecessors, right? The ongoing kind of traditions of banjo griot, the banjo griot traditions, where it's been passed down from father to son to daughter and so on. Elizabeth Cotton, another one, fantastic, fantastic player. She played left-handed because that's the only way she knew how to play, and she learned it from her father, who learned it from his, and so on and so forth. So you have these stories told over decades, centuries, even that kind of make their way here. And so with that 1830s, 60s, 1870s, more or less minstrelsy, kind of moving into string band where you'd have the banjo and the fiddle played together. And then eventually you'd have like the string band tradition kind of taking off around that time too, particularly around the 80s where you just have like guitar and other things kind of making their way in there, mandolin. So yeah, around the 1880s is where you start to see the shift away from kind of minstrelsy. Minstrelsy starts to fall out of popularity around the 1880s, 90s into the 90s. It doesn't mean it went anywhere because Virginia Tech had a minstrel troupe in the 1880s, I believe. It's in the yearbook.
When we talk about minstrel troops, are we specifically talking about people doing blackface? That's what that is. I just want to make sure that I understand it correctly.
Yeah, for the most part, they're doing blackface and caricatures of black people, usually incredibly racist, stereotypical depictions of black people, either as, again, like I said, as like the dim-witted buffoon, as a criminal, as a rapist, as whatever they decide to do. It's never a good thing. It's always as a way to demean African American people. And this was also give precedence to violence against African American people, whether it be lynching or whether it be other forms of violence like enslavement as well. So yeah, or in legal codes as well. Just being able to live your life as a free person was also heavily influenced by minstrelsy early on.
Yeah. What's fascinating to me because I think growing up in Appalachia, I think it stereotypically I would not have assumed that the banjo had the type of history that it had and the racial history that it had. I think most of the time when I heard of banjos, the first thing I thought of was deliverance. And that was the stereotype that was in my mind. And so I'm curious, when you get like through the 1900s, do we still have African Americans? I'm assuming there are still some playing the banjo, but is it still as popular? Did it wane off? Is it picking back up, or what's the history there?
Yeah, so that history is interesting, and I think the history is it's picking up, right? African American banjo players are picking it up more, but around like the 1900s, right, the music industry starts to come into full effect. The music industry is very, very interesting because, like I said, the music industry is operating under these notions of colonial rule, imperial rule, right? These ideas of race and class and how things should be according to racial structures, according to class structures that were created by those in power, those in charge, right? And so the music industry was operating on that standard. And they were recording early on in the 1800s, late 1800s, like 1880s, 1890s. They were recording on like those wax kind of records. You know what I'm talking about? The early, very, very early recording software. We'll call it software. And they were making records for all over, for like Russian viewers, for listeners, and for Indian listeners, and so on and so forth. So they were making all this music. So they were trying to get a feel of how to really do a music industry, and they thought they found their niche where they could just kind of divide people according to what they believed they wanted to listen to. So Indian people obviously want to listen to Indian music, as an example. Russian people want to listen to Russian music. That was kind of their gist. That was their idea. And again, it's like this imperial kind of thinking, this colonial thinking that like people only want to listen to one specific thing that we curate for them. And in some ways, yes, that's true. Sure, people want to listen to music maybe that people like them make, right? That makes sense. But around the 90s, where the music industry really starts to kick off, a lot of African Americans have put down the banjo. and they had put down the banjo because of that century or so of minstrelsy, right? Where you have these demeaning stereotypes, this demeaning image of the African American through the banjo as this kind of dim-witted buffoon, as this criminal almost. I mean, even in the, what is it? When was Birth of the Nation? It was like 1916, 1917, right? With Woodrow Wilson.
Something around that time period, yes, I
Yeah,
think.
the first film ever debuted at the White House. And so you have this history, and African people, but African American people see this, and why would you want to be associated with that? Many put down the banjo because, one, it didn't make sense to play it anymore, because there's this long history of oppression and just trauma with the banjo. Even if your grandfather played it, your father played it before you, your uncles and everyone around you played the banjo, it's not worth it at this point. And also because at the same time when the music industry was developing, the people who were allowed to play the banjo and make record music were white people, not black people. So you have this segregation immediately enforced around this time that, well, this is hillbilly music and only white people play hillbilly music. But for black people, we want them to play jazz. We want them to play like blues and these other forms of music not associated with ragtime, things like that, right? Not associated with white people, so to speak, even though white people would ultimately, right, be the ones recording that music too. So you have all this going on at the same time. You have these, again, like I talked about at the very beginning, these structures of race and class that are embedded very early on in the music industry, and how the music industry ought to operate according to how those in power believe things should operate, right? Because you also have eugenics going on at this time too in the US, which is a history that we also don't really recognize.
I don't know, it's very interesting to me, the history of the banjo and how it is this artifact that's really bared witness to the history of racism and institutional racism and all these different aspects of American history. I'm curious, what role do you think the banjo could play in any form of reconciliation?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, there's an acknowledgement that has to come about. I think that in order to move on from anything, or to kind of reconcile, I suppose is the better word, not move on, because, it's hard to really move on for that, but to reconcile is to acknowledge that this past exists, to acknowledge that this history is there, that these things happen. And I think a lot of people don't know that history. A lot of people don't know what happened, and maybe they don't want to, but also it's because these stories aren't told, and it's not uncommon. It's not an uncommon thing within American history that stories that paint the American dream as something other than rose colored, rose tinted, right, is usually censored. Whether it be in West Virginia, and you think of the Blair Mountain, right, and you think of the Battle of Blair Mountain, you think of the Mine Wars. A lot of that is kind of unknown, right, and the history of unions and the bloodshed that has gone on in this country is often overlooked and completely ignored. The same thing is within the banjos. If we don't acknowledge that this history happened, if we continue with this perception that the banjo was this white instrument and that African Americans had no role to play at all in it, then there's no real chance for reconciliation. There's no real chance for solidarity. My whole goal with this dissertation is, and my project and my work is to provide an understanding that this history does happen, and it has happened. It's continuing to happen. And by bringing attention to it and telling these stories, not just historically, but also current day, right, understandings of, which I guess is still historically, of what's going on, and bringing attention and awareness to these histories, that we can kind of move towards a better, I guess, a better form of solidarity, a better understanding of, like, in fact, the banjo is the unification of all people in one way or another, because of this mix that had gone on, right? Despite all the trouble, all the turmoil, all the horrific racism, the horrific violence that has come from minstrelsy, that has come from slavery, there is still something beautiful about that camaraderie that also occurred, where you have people playing together, you have people speaking together, learning from one another, and talking, and you have all that history in between. But, like, there's something about that unity, right? And it's always that unity that gets separated, that gets kind of lost in the history. So it's about bringing that together and talking about, well, your interests are the same as those in which you see as the other, right? It's us versus them. It's always that kind of mentality. Well, in fact, the them that you're pointing to is actually, they have your interest in mind. They actually want the same things that you want. And the banjo is a way to kind of like bring that back and kind of tell these stories again. Really, that history is, I don't have enough time to really speak through it all. But I think that's a good way to kind of think through it, is bringing awareness to those histories and those echoes, right? The banjo echoes from early on making their way to modern day music, and kind of tracing that and thinking about, your own path, your own struggles, but also the ways in which, like, the people that you're supposedly against or that are your enemy are in fact your closest allies in all things.
Do you have a favorite banjo player?
Favorite banjo player? Bela Fleck is probably the greatest banjo player at this point. He's phenomenal. I don't know if you know who Bela Fleck is, but he was here at the Moss. I would say he's up there. Who was the guy for the Punch Brothers, the lead of the Punch Brothers, or one of the banjo players in the Punch Brothers? I think it's Thomas Pickney. Let me make sure. That might be just a theorist that I'm thinking of, actually.
I think between Ryan and Givens and Bela Fleck, you just eliminated all the people I know that are famous banjo players. So other than Steve Martin.
Yeah, Steve Martin's fun too. No, Noam Pickleney. He's a fantastic. I think the Punch Brothers is doing some incredible stuff with bluegrass by kind of bringing it into mainstream a bit more, and changing the sound. Also, John Hartford. He's one of my favorites, just because he's kind of the father of newgrass, and a really really fantastic player. He died in 2000, I believe, of like lymphoma, which is really sad because he's one of the greats. You have the early players too. You have Odo Thompson and Joe Thompson and his cousin. They were fantastic. You have people from my hometown like Fuzz Harrison. You have, is it Dink? His name Dink Roberts, I think, is his name. Let me make sure, because I want to give him props. Yeah, Dink Roberts, probably the preeminent banjo player, the black banjo player, black banjo traditions. Dink Roberts. There's several albums out there now about, I think it's Black Banjo Songsters of North Carolina, the Piedmont, and so that's a great album to check out. You get to hear all of them, all the great like early banjo players that were never picked up by the music industry.